Are we going? Yeah. So,
Okay. It's on. Well, good evening, everyone. Those of you who are with us in person at Now Hall of the University of Virginia. And good morning to those of you, including our commentator, Wu Shan, who is in Asia. I want to welcome all of you to this, which is the second in a series of 4 lectures by Brantly Womack, who has recently retired as a joint faculty member in both the Miller School of Public Affairs and the Department of Politics. Brantly is giving us a series of lectures on basically the evolution of what some call East Asia, some call the Western Pacific, and focusing on China's evolving role in that region, both in reality and as it's perceived. The first lecture was a review of the history of that relationship, where, as Brantly put it, for a variety of reasons, its large population, its productivity, its advanced culture, and its presence, by which I meant basically how it perceived itself and how it was perceived by others. China occupied for many centuries the central role. It was the center of that region. In the second lecture, he will be discussing the decentering of the region. China plays a lesser role, and he'll explain why. The third lecture will talk about the recentering of the region, again on China. And then the fourth, the concluding lecture, will ask what does it all mean for the world, for the region going forward. After Brantly gives his lecture, we will have some comments by Professor Wu Shan of the Academia Sinica in Taiwan. I'll introduce him after Brantly finishes, and then we will have Q&A. My wife, Professor Shirley Lin, will be helping me monitor both the questions that are coming in online through the Q&A function and maybe the chat room as well. And we will also have microphones. Still don't know how to keep my mask on my nose, despite many months of practice. We'll be taking questions from the floor, and Brian will arrange for a student assistant to pass around a microphone. So without further ado, let me welcome back to this podium for the second lecture in the series, Professor Brantly Womack.
I think I'm at a safe distance from everyone, so I think I'll take my mask off. Well, thank you, Harry, for your introduction and for putting today's program in context of the lecture last time. And I see that Wang Gongwu is joining us, and he provided such excellent commentary last week. And giving this picture of this large-scale development in East Asia, or Pacific Asia, or Western Pacific, whatever you want to call it, the region that would be East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the developments over time. And just a reminder of what our task here is, and that is we're trying to present a big picture of China's relationship to Pacific Asia. We're rethinking the big picture is worth the effort because the changes in the current era are so fundamental that we need to step back from current events in order to understand what's happening. We are presenting the historical dynamics of the relationship because it contains the public memories that China and its neighbors bring to understanding the current situation, and also because it helps differentiate the continuities as well as the changes between the different eras. Last time, as Harry pointed out, we talked about China and East Asia, but the framework tonight, the framework when we're talking about the era of modernization, of Westernization, has to be broader than just the region. It's still asymmetric. It's the West and the rest, but the connectivity is sharp rather than thin. In East Asia, the modern era was an abrupt end of its own order, forced by outside powers. For the West, it was an extension and validation of its competitive expansion. Western modernity transformed the content and the context of East Asia. There was no new center in East Asia itself. Each conquered part now served a different power. And even the non-colonies, Japan, China, Siam, were no less oriented, or you might say disoriented, toward Western powers. Japan tried and failed to later on to recenter East Asia with its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But it tried to do so on the Western model of conquest, and that failed. The root factors of China's pre-modern centrality lost their salience in this current period, in the period we're talking about tonight. As we shall see, the pre-modern situational advantages that we discussed last time of presence, population, and production were turned on their head. China became a non-presence. Its large population came to be seen as an inertial drag, and its artisanal production was displaced by industrialization. Without its pre-modern situational advantages, China's former asymmetric relationship to East Asia wilted, and its connectivity went from being a carefully managed thin connectivity to being an insignificant dotted line in its relationships to the rest of East Asia. With the establishment of the PRC in 1949, China overcame its domestic disunity. But for the next 30 years, it took an entirely different path from its neighbors. While they participated in the globalized order of the American imperium, China isolated itself and was ostracized by the West. Not until the death of Mao Zedong and the return of Deng Xiaoping did China open its doors. China's turn was welcome as a validation of market-based modernization. But then the Tiananmen turmoil in 1989, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union and of European communism, made China look like a latecomer to the end of history. Nevertheless, by the turn of the century, China's continued growth made it a significant other to its neighbors, though not a regional center. The America-centered global order prevailed until 2008. So tonight we begin by discussing East Asia's connectivity to the West, not to China. This was a sharp, enforced connectivity, broadened after the Second World War to a less pointed but more intense global connectivity. Similarly, East Asia's modern perceptual asymmetry between the superiority of the powerful modern West and its own threatened identity and autonomy was a significant aspect of the relationship. The end of colonialism enabled the emergence of national sovereignties, but these sovereignties were still constrained by the US-led global order that was beyond their influence. We will discuss East Asia connectivity and asymmetry with the West in two phases then. One is the colonial phase from 1840 to late 1940s. And the second phase will be the American imperium from 1945 to 2008. Then we will analyze what happened to China's apparently solid situational advantages of presence, population, and production. But first, an appetizer. To advance this thing somehow. There it goes. Imagine the famous economic historian, Angus Madison, coming to the court of Emperor Jiaqing in 1820. What would he have to say? Well, of course, he'd be very polite. And he would start by saying that congratulations that China is not a failed country. China is a successful country. Madison would point out that China is, at the time, in 1820, 1/3 of the world production. And I imagine that Jiaqing would listen to this and be happy to have this friendly foreigner there. And then he would be puzzled that he would ask, what is a globe? He wasn't very globally conscious at the time. And Madison would evade that question and go on to his next point, which was, beware. The West is out there. And even though they're only 28% of global production, they are well armed with a big navy and they are hungry. So beware the dangers at sea. And I imagine that Jiaqing would think about this and then say, well, that's probably not as big a problem as you would imagine, Mr. Madison. Because as Professor Wang Gungwu told us last week, China's main dangers are to the north, not from the ocean. Now, you have pesky pirates out there, but you don't have real problems coming from the seas. Then Madison would get glum and he would make a fateful prediction. He would say, by 1950, that 1/3 the world's production will have shrunk to 5% of the world's production. And the production per capita in your country will be less in that amount of time than it is now. So things are going to happen. And that's the question that we're facing, particularly at the beginning of today's talk, is what happened? What is the sharp connectivity that undermined this apparently prosperous country in 1820? So sharp connectivity is what we're focusing on. Very different, remember, from the thin connectivity that characterized the pre-modern era in Chinese politics. Thin connectivity, first of all, it was thin because there weren't that many products being exchanged. The global economy was not as thick as it is now, but it was also managed to be thin because the biggest problem was avoiding risk, not maximizing profit, not increasing next year's trade, increasing next year's connectivity, but making sure that no problems developed. So that's thin connectivity. Well, the West sharp connectivity was quite different. In the colonial phase, remember, we'll be talking about the colonial phase and then the post-World War II phase, a separate times. In the colonial phase, Westernization was a situation of modernity owned and managed by Western powers. In the 1930s in China, the words 西方化 and 现代化 were seen as interchangeable. Now, Westernization meant modernization, and modernization meant Westernization. That was the only model available. And it was the ownership of this by the West was a key element. Then you have in the colonial phase the political repackaging of Asia. First of all, new boundaries. It's not as dramatic as in Africa when you have the drawing of all these broad straight lines right through geographical barriers, et cetera. But still, that repackaging of Asia into colonies was very important. So you have Vietnam divided into 3 parts and combined with Laos and Cambodia into French Indochina. You have the expansion of Dutch control in the islands that became all of parts of Indonesia during the 19th century. You have the various other types of boundary situations, and the boundaries mean more now. The boundaries are sovereign lines of control, of ownership between countries, whereas before many of those boundaries were more indistinct, settled maybe by ethnic minorities different from the majority populations of both countries and living in a kind of frontier zone. On the border of China and Vietnam in 1900, 90% of the residents were neither Vietnamese nor Han Chinese, or neither ethnic Vietnamese or Han Chinese. So this political repackaging is a major aspect, especially since each of those colonies was going to a different mother country. Then you have the transformation of domestic societies into commodity service of colonial powers. And this is really important. Shell oil in Indonesia for the Dutch, Michelin rubber in Vietnam for the French, the tin mines of the British in Malaya. These things were the most obvious aspects of the transformation of local economies. But if you think about it, the local economy of a country like Indonesia or Vietnam was primarily subsistence, and subsistence economies don't make money for their foreign owners. So those economies, even the rice-producing parts of those economies, had to be rearranged. And the country I know best of these in Vietnam, large-scale landlord farms replaced local village communal ownership of land. And what you get is a vast increase in the amount of rice that the French could sell. And Vietnam became their most profitable colony. But the amount of rice that each Vietnamese ate in the 1930s went down. So you could scrape more rice off the top of a landlord system than you could get out of villages where they were only dealing with trading their surplus. So you have this type of transformation into commodity service. Then you have in China a chaos situation, preservation of a weak empire against the Taipings. First, some Westerners were excited about the Taipings because of the Western elements of their ideology. But as they thought about it, and they thought, do we want to deal with a possibly powerful kingdom who may go in strange directions, or do we want to deal with the good old Qing dynasty? They supported the dynasty. And then after that, you have the warlords. And the warlords were supported by this or that foreign power. But basically, all of them would be more concerned about a reunification of China, including the reunification by Chiang Kai-shek in 1927, than they would be about continued disunity in China. Okay, another important thing for China is that it was too big to swallow. It was too big for one country to take as a colony. The Japanese eventually tried it, but they failed. But it was a tempting nibble. So you have Victoria Island, Hong Kong Island, being taken by the British in 1840. You have 1860, several more land transfers, and beginning at 1861 to 1916, you have 92 different treaty ports in China. Not necessarily in 92 cities, because there would be multiple treaty-related settlements in the same city. But still, basically, countries took what they could get from China. Japan took Taiwan in 1895. The Japanese took Manchukuo in 1931. They took, then they occupied China, parts of China from 1937 to 1945. Mongolia declared its independence in 1921. Tibet removed the soldiers, the last Qing soldiers that were left in 1913. So you have this, not a disintegration of China, but parts of it leaving home. And then within the remaining core of China that remained, you have foreign ownership of railroads and foreign control of the customs service. Another important aspect of this colonial phase was the beginning of large-scale migration of Chinese to Southeast Asia. For centuries, Chinese had been going to Southeast Asia and been involved in trade networks. But with the fall of the Qing dynasty, the restrictions that the Qing dynasty had put on were removed. And these Nanyang Chinese, these Southeast Asian Chinese, became very, very important to the economies of the colonial powers in Vietnam, in Indonesia, etc. Not, well, Northeast Asia is a different story, with Japan maintaining itself, and then colonizing Philippines, Southeast Asia, South colonizing Korea and Taiwan. But in Southeast Asia, especially, the Nanyang Chinese became important. And because they were coming in urban occupations, they became richer than the local population, which remained primarily rural. And because they were foreigners brought in or allowed to come in by the colonial governments, they were vulnerable to the colonial governments and also vulnerable to the jealousies and envies of the local population. So the Nanyang Chinese became extremely important and remain extremely important. But you could see the origins of the racial tensions in Southeast Asia from the way this expansion occurred in the last 100 years. And then we have Japan as the exception. Japan is the country that could maintain itself by being alert and effective in copying Western methods. And its success was deeply appreciated by its Asian neighbors. 1900, 1910, that period especially, Japan actively fostered the learning of Chinese students who were coming in and students from the rest of East Asia as well. And many of the modern terms in Chinese come from Japanese translations from this era. So there was this period at the beginning of the 20th century where Japan was a leader in East Asia and in East Asian modernization. But as Japan militarized, then it developed its own habits of following the Western model perhaps too closely and trying to expand its control, not just of Korea and Taiwan and Manchuria, then China, then Southeast Asia. So it was the exception, but then the exception that proved the rule of the colonial period. Okay, what about the American imperium, 1945 to 2008? Obviously very different from the colonial period, okay, but with some similarities. You have the defeat of Japan, the decolonization, not necessarily American decolonization, because we didn't have that many colonies, but something we were in favor of organized, orderly decolonization elsewhere, most places. There are some exceptions. And we are in favor of globalized governance, mainly because the globalized governance, the UN, the GATT, World Bank, all of these organizations were organizations that the United States had leadership control of. We had belief in development and market, and the belief that as countries become more developed, they will become more like us. And I think of, now, Harry is the expert on the engagement of the United States with China, but I think of China as the last case of this type of assumption that development brings democracy, development brings a government that will like us better. And of course, in the 1950s, the success of the reconstitution of Europe, the Marshall Plan, the success of Japan's reemergence, they gave evidence that this type of the generosity toward development could have positive effects. And then our intrusion in world politics, it was also sharp. It certainly got into the politics of other countries. But at least intentionally, it was not for profit, but for global strategic reasons of the Cold War. We didn't get involved in the war in Vietnam because because we saw the French making lots of money there and we wanted to get the money ourselves. Now that's very interesting. The French did make money in Vietnam. They made it, though, by being shrewd in what they could get done there, by being stingy by being good marketers of the rice and other products coming from Vietnam. We weren't interested. That was beneath us. We were not colonists. We were not trying to make money on Vietnam. And sure enough, we didn't. Vietnam, the rice of South Vietnam had been the rice basket of the world, had been the main rice export for the French Empire. By 1969, after our full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War, South Vietnam became a net rice importer. So you can't say we did it in order to make money on Vietnam. And that whole idea of global strategy, the domino theory, other type, we had to have a global reason for doing something in an area. Our politics, local politics, was derivative. And then Taiwan provides, over this whole period, a frontier of US and Chinese power. To start with, in October 25th, 1949, the Chinese tried to take the island of Quemoy by a naval invasion and failed. And that was, US support wasn't involved in that. That was the Kuomintang defeating the communists. There's not very many cases of that in the Civil War, but that happens to be the last of the battles, and it counted. And it showed the weakness, the naval weakness of the PRC. And then the United States sent the Seventh Fleet in the Taiwan Straits, but we were shown by the Korean War that we did not want to get involved, that China was likely to be a strong adversary. So we didn't want to get involved, so we tried to control Chiang Kai-shek's attempts to reestablish control of the mainland, which certainly would have had difficulties in any case. I won't go through the whole history of this relationship, but if you think of the Taiwan PRC relationship as a frontier of power, something ambiguous, something changing over time, United States, as Nixon tries to get out of Vietnam, that increases China's leverage on US-China normalization, and then the relationship seesaws back and forth and goes on today. So what about the asymmetry in the relationship with Western centrality? Well, in colonial domination, the colonial side was pretty easy. We won, you lost. That could be established. And it was power with the excuse of higher culture. A higher culture could be religion against the unbelievers. It could be higher culture against lower culture. Eventually, it became more sophisticated as modern Western Gesellschaft, society, against traditional Gemeinschaft, community. And so we're trying to help these communities to become societies, become complex parts of a general, larger world. And then you have pseudo-equality and domination. The best example of that, I think, is the leasing of the new territories by the British from the Qing dynasty in 1898. Because here you have the British signing a 99-year lease, so it looks like an equal arrangement, more equal than simply seizing territory, as they did with Victoria Island and with the Kowloon Peninsula. But look at the details. There was no compensation paid for the Qing dynasty for losing the new territories. There were several provisions in the agreement for Qing residual rights within the new territory. And those quickly were ignored by the Brits. So essentially, then you have to ask the question, why did they sign a 99-year lease rather than simply seizing the territory? And the answer to that is they didn't want other countries seizing territory. So basically, they didn't sign a 99-year lease because they wanted to give it up in 99 years, which is what happened. They just wanted a 99-year lease so that no one else would be establishing colonies the way the British did. Okay, so what about the view from below of colonial domination? Well, from below, it was identity denied and transformed. And both of those elements are important. The denial of identity as a traditional identity was traumatic. The transformation of identity over time was also important because identity doesn't simply stay the same. It interacts with circumstances and with groups. You have radical critique, resistance, and defense against colonialism, but you also have collaboration and transformation of outlook during the period of colonialism. So it's not simply a question of righteous resistance. It's a question of it's a much more complex picture of adaptation, of collaboration, and it produces a result that's quite different from the initial or the traditional society. And then we can look at the Russian Revolution as a kind of alternative to the model of Western modernization because it was a forward-looking model, because it was based on a critique of imperialism, but not a critique of imperialism, therefore we can go back to the past, but a critique of imperialism as a critique of imperialism as something that was at its last stage of capitalism and therefore should move on to a transformed global pattern of communism. What did things look like with the American imperium? Well, from above, we asked countries to become like us, prosperous and free. Who could resist that? What right-thinking person could resist that? And we had the attitude that we were the city on the hill against the evil empire. So the Cold War, and everything everything could be justified. Anything could be done to defend the city on the hill against the evil empire, and the evil empire would stop at nothing. So you have a removal of many controls on interactive relationships. The second thing that's important from the look from above in the US is all local is global. Whereas in the colonial period, the Dutch were interested in Indonesia, okay? And that's the place they wanted to develop. Any increase in production of Indonesia that they could capture would be theirs. And that was very important to the growth of the Dutch economy, okay? For us, we wanted to prevent the rise of communism. We wanted to help the rise of capitalism. We were not that interested in, and we derived our politics at the local level from our view of the situation at the global level. That got us into Angola. That got us into Vietnam. That got us into all sorts of countries. And still, it's interesting to see how that mentality outlives the Cold War. Okay, what was the view from below? Well, it's more complicated in this post-Second World War period because the American relationship was more complicated. And it was not as sharp. It was hard, but not as sharp as the relationship under colonialism. You had a hub and spoke situation. You had deference from most of the establishment in other countries. You had a distance from parts of the establishment and parts of the intelligentsia. That is, they saw problems with what the Americans were doing, but they didn't necessarily support an alternative. And then you had insurgency, which is a very broad term that includes everything from local riots of desperate people to organized opposition. But let me point out two structural things. First of all, the reason why the alternatives were limited at the American period was that it was a hub and spoke arrangement. If you were a country dealing with the United States, you didn't really have an your alternative was to deal with the United States and be part of a global world, or not deal and not be part of a global world. So you had this hub and spoke relationship. As we'll see when we talk about later globalization, that sense of having alternatives is one of the major characteristics of the current era. And something I would like to point out is the role of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I think that was one of the best multilateral diplomatic accomplishments of this era, because it was a group of countries, each of which was vulnerable. It was set up in 1967. Each of them was vulnerable to domestic insurgency in the country. These were weak governments in general. Each of these were vulnerable to their neighbors, and each of these were vulnerable to outside powers far stronger than any one of them. They got together in this association, Southeast Asian nations, a consensus organization of grouped vulnerability, not an alliance against a particular enemy, but a group based on consensus and based on inclusivity to the extent that that was possible. And for 30 years, people looked at ASEAN, Westerners looking at ASEAN and say, huh, that's nothing, it's just talk show. That talk show did tremendous things for the political culture, international political culture of the region, and for its stature as a region in dealing with the rest of the world. So what happened to China's 3 Ps, to presence, population, and production during these two eras, during these two phases? Well, first of all, 1840 to 1949, by 1880, China was no neighbor's primary concern. Every neighbor had to worry about someplace else more than they worried about China. Even Japan, which by 1880 was getting strong, and so it was still learning from Germany and Britain. So by no major, if it's no neighbor's primary concern after 1880, how could it be a presence? How could it be a regional presence? It wasn't. And it was not even a colony. Colonies had colonial countries coordinating commercial transformation of the economy. This is true of what the Japanese were doing in Taiwan, producing a rice export economy over the period of the first half of the 19th century. They were doing it in Korea, and when they took Manchuria, they did it in Manchuria too. So you had that type of attention to the resources and material transformation of the era, because that's the profit for the mother country. China was an orphan. China didn't have a mother country. It didn't have a country interested in that type of coordinated commercial transformation. So it had tactical investment from the outside, but not strategic investment. The overwhelming majority of imports into China before 1950 were consumer goods, not producer goods. So to East Asia, China was a fellow victim, not a sinner. And that chaos of China that modernization created was ended by an isolated village level revolution, not by a global movement. And we'll return to that at the end, because there's an interesting possibility that I'll raise, that Mao Zedong's rural revolution was made possible by this decentering of China. Okay, what about presence? Well, in 1949 to 2008, this is the second period of presence. Global isolation with dreams of third world revolutionary leadership kept China by itself. It was isolated, it was embargoed, but it wasn't really that interested in being part of a globalized world. Then you have Deng Xiaoping in the opening from 1979 to 1980 died. And that was seen not as China returning to a central position, but China joining the world as a junior partner. Okay, and that was, everybody was very happy with that. When President Reagan visited China, he went to a free market and saw people selling and buying things. He thought that was very nice. Then you had Tiananmen and the collapse of European communism, and China looked like it was, the question was, how long will China last? You know, communism is dead. China doesn't know it yet, that type of problem. But the economy continued to develop. And from 1997, especially with the Asian financial crisis in 1997, China started to become a significant other to the other countries of Asia, not a center, because the world system, the global system led by the United States, was still more important than any regional organization. Okay, what happened with population? Well, population was very interesting. It's 1820, 56% of East Asia, 37% of the world. But then that dropped. By 1900, 50% of East Asia, 25% of the world. It was a population that was poor, inert, and disorganized. As historian Tawny put it, the Chinese peasant is like a person standing up to his neck in water. The slightest ripple will drown him. Okay, so they had that problem. And China's, the size of Chinese population made the problem that much harder to solve. And what about China's military force? Remember, in the pre-modern era, China's population at least raised the possibility of having a significant military force. Well, the military force in the first half of the 20th century was used mainly against itself and not coordinated and not doing that good of a job. You can see that in their efforts against Japan. Okay, so what happened after 1949 with the founding of the People's Republic of China? You have a second population explosion, doubling in 40 years. And the first effect of that population explosion is a demographic deficit from 1962 to 1980. That is, the number of kids and a growing older population, because the life expectancy went up, meant that the working population was a smaller percentage of the total population. So it's demographic deficit. Then starting in 1980 and lasting to the present, you have a demographic dividend in China. And this is due most spectacularly to the one-child policy, but also for policies controlling families from 1972 on. And here you have China going from being above the dependency ratio, the world dependency ratio, to going below that dependency ratio. So having more workers as a percentage of population. And this, of course, aided the rapid development, especially rapid development of industrial production in China during the reform era. And you have a big but defensive military until the 1990s. The Persian Gulf War was a wake-up call to the Chinese military that they couldn't simply use large numbers of troops with outdated equipment and expect to survive. So you have the modernization of the military starting in the 1990s and continuing since then. What about production? Well, 1820s, 1949, mostly subsistence. And you have a global descent into insignificance. And it becomes a regional orphan. What's China got to sell to Japan? Okay. China had been a target for silver and gold coming from Mexico and other places to buy tea and porcelain, et cetera. This type of situation declined because intensive silk, tea, ceramics production was displaced by industrial scale production. Mass production replaced artisanal production. And then an interesting case of import substitution occurred. Remember, if you know the Opium War in 1840, the British were bringing opium in. And one of the reasons they were bringing the opium and selling it to China was because they were spending a lot of money on Chinese tea. And so the silver was flowing into China, and they needed to balance the trade. So they raised opium in Bengal especially and brought that into China. Chinese protested, they burned opium and that started the war. Well, 1860, one of the Treaty of Shenzhen, the Brits required the legalization of opium, presumably in order to increase their sales to China, but they really had the effect of increasing Chinese opium production. So by 1900, the second most valuable interprovincial trade was opium trade after rice. So you have that type of import substitution. Meanwhile, India grows tea. And so you had Chinese tea replaced by Indian tea in India and Indian opium replaced by Chinese opium in China. What about 1949 to 2008? Well, notice we're not simply talking about the growth of the economy, but China's position in East Asia. And Stalinist heavy industrialization did nothing for its relationships to its neighbors. It did something for developing core industries in China. But then you have self-sufficiency and defensive relocation away from the coast in the Maoist era. Both of these cut links to the global economy. And then you had disasters like Great Leap Forward. You had a freeze on urban populations, and you had decommercialization in the cities. So all of these things made China's picture abroad shrink, even as China was growing itself. China wasn't as chaotic or as unproductive as it had been 40 years ago, but it was just as isolated. It was more isolated. It was just as ineffective as a trading partner. Then you have the command economy's approach to trade, which is a form of thin connectivity. That is, in a command economy, you don't maximize your trade. What you do when you need an import, you need a necessary import, you sell enough of something in order to afford to buy that import. So that's what I mean by centrally command economy, thin connectivity. Then in 1980, you have opening the door, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Taiwan in the world. And China makes tremendous progress doing this, but from such a low base. As we'll talk about next time, China's economy per capita, it was poorer than Laos. It was poorer than the poor countries of the region when the opening began. So it took many 10% growth, 10% growth, 10% growth to reach a significant amount of growth. Okay, so in the conclusion, I would like to address several different kinds of things, somewhat unrelated, but reflections on what we've covered. First of all, China's victimhood. It's real. China didn't ask for these things to happen to it. But what happened and by who? Its first victimhood was by too much traditional success. It had reached limits of agricultural productivity with its technology. It had reached complacency. It was trying to run an overly centralized system with too few people. It had all sorts of problems domestically at that time that made it less capable, not just ignoring the pirates, for instance, but less capable of doing major adjustments in the system. Too much involution, to use a word that's become popular lately. It certainly was a victim of the West as well, Opium War, etc. And it was a victim of Japan. But it was also a victim of modernization. It was a victim of a kind of change that undermined and replaced the system that it was familiar with and did it from the outside. So all of these things, they created a situation that created challenges for China that it has to deal with. Second thing I'd like to point out is that if you look at the village revolution in China, which is the key to the foundation of the People's Republic of China, China's orphan status, its inert rural population, and its inconsequential production could be seen as prerequisites for the success of rural revolution. What if China had a strong system? What if China had a strong colonial power? What if China was producing something that was vitally important? What if China had a resource curse of some sort? Could it have had a successful rural revolution? It's dependent very much on little by little control of this village and that village and expanding from there. However, I have to say that a successful rural revolution is not inevitable. It is, in my opinion, the least likely major event of the 20th century to have had the rural revolution in China. Last thing is the Westernization and the conflation of Westernization and modernization. In China, the periphery was considered unequal outsiders, but they were respected as agents in their own affairs. Not in the tribute system, China recognized the king of Korea and did not interfere in the Korean king's management of his realm. Colonial West, the rest were subjects needing transformation. They had no agency. American imperium, you have agency is good as long as it leads to compliance with the US foreign policy and more generally with the American model, but agency in any other direction was suspect. So different attitudes toward agency. But the general changes brought on by modernization were generally accepted. Resistance tended to be against force and inequality rather than a rejection of modernization. Moreover, there was an awareness of interacting with a global community and fundamental transformation of traditional horizons and to some extent of traditional identities. It's hard to imagine a villager anywhere in Asia now asking the question, what is a globe? They're part of it. So thank you. And I look forward to Wu Yushan's comments.
Thank you very much, Brantly, for a lecture that was clearly organized, extremely articulately delivered, but most importantly, very thought-provoking and insightful. A good follow-on to the first lecture and makes me eager to hear the next two. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the commentator for this evening's lecture. It's a great personal pleasure to do so because Wu Yushan is a friend and colleague whom I've known for many, many years now. Dr. Wu is an academician and distinguished research fellow in the Institute of Political Science at the Academia Sinica, the Central Academy, the Zhongyang Yanjiuyuan in Taiwan, and also is a member of the politics faculty at National Taiwan University. Yushan earned his PhD from Berkeley in the political science department there, and is a widely published comparative scholar of comparative politics, comparative political economy, as well as cross-strait relations. Beginning with his first book, Comparative Political Economic Transformations, Mainland China, Hungary, the Soviet Union, and Taiwan, he's shown his ability to do very insightful comparative research, again, focusing to a very large degree on the broad questions of political economy. But he's also done important work in international affairs, particularly on the different kinds of hedging strategies by which smaller countries in the Asia-Pacific region try to navigate the increasingly fraught relationship between China and the United States. The title of what I regard as the seminal work that he produced on this topic gives you an idea of what these different strategies are: pivot, hedger, or partner, strategies of lesser powers caught between hegemons. So it's a great pleasure now to turn to Professor Wu Yushan, who's joining us, as you know, from Taiwan, to give his commentary on tonight's lecture by Brantly Womack. Great to see you, Yushan. I trust you're there, and we look forward to your commentary. Thanks for joining us. No, still can't hear you. Can you turn your volume up? Now we can hear you, but it's very faint. Still can't. He's not muted. That's a green thing. So he's okay. You're not muted, but the volume is too low.
It might be your computer's mute button rather than Zoom.
Nothing yet.
Yusha, we heard you before you started. So it must be possible. Still way too soft.
Can you check your microphone setting on the button next to the speaker on the bottom left corner and check your input is correct?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now.
Very good.
Thanks so much.
Okay. So you can hear me.
Feel free.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I cannot hear you clearly, but as long as you can hear me. Okay, I would like to congratulate Professor Brantly Womack for capturing the long history of East Asia by dividing it into 3 historical periods: the continuous century in the pre-modern history of East Asia, decentering, and recentering. For each period, Brantly talks about China's presence, population, and production, the 3 Ps, asymmetric relation between the center and the periphery, and the relational connectivity. With these important dimensions, Brantly captures the essence of 3 historical periods. Now, I would like to use his analytical framework and probe deeper into the dynamics of evolution of East Asian international system. I would argue that it is the institution or the modernization route that determines China's power. And from that power, China's self-perception and other countries in East Asia and outside East Asia, China perception are formed, and China's relations with its neighbors in East Asia and outside East Asia are based. So from institution to power. And then from that power, we can talk about the degree of centering in East Asia. So I'm doing this by starting with institution, and then power, and then centering. I think the centering of East Asia is the quote-unquote dependent variable of Brantly Womack's wonderful four-part talks. I think the centering, decentering, and recentering of East Asia actually reflects China's power. The Chinese culture, people may ask, is also important, right, in defining China's relation with other countries. And so it seems that we should not simply concentrate on power per se and realism, but also the Chinese culture. But then we have to understand the Chinese culture was formed during the centuries of China's hegemony in East Asia. So it's very difficult to separate power and culture. Of the two, I would say power is the base and culture grows out of it. So how China perceives itself and how China is perceived by its neighbors is basically determined by China's power. Today, the rising tension between the West and China has more to do with China's rising power than anything else. We all know that China's system and its ideology actually didn't change that much since the 1980s and 1990s when the open door policy and the reform were launched. And what we are seeing today is a power transition between the United States and China. Some people like Allison would call it the Thucydides trap, namely if you have a hegemon and then you have a rising power catching up with that hegemon and closing the gap between the two, then there will be high tension and probably war. So power is the essence. Given China's huge landmass and resources, what determines China's power is productivity and technology. The centering, decentering, and recentering of East Asia is basically determined by whether China can adopt a system that can raise its productivity and technology, a political economic institution that can rapidly modernize the country's economic base. So let's take a closer look at the period of modernization and decentering of East Asia covered in today's talk. When the multipolar competitive Westphalian system of the West met the hierarchical China-centered system of the East, initially there was only some minor encroachment on the Chinese system when the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and the Dutch came. But later, industrialization made a huge difference, and the West, led by the British, came not as merchants, missionaries, arms dealers, but as conquerors. From the very beginning, it was the technology and productivity gap that determined the relation between the West and East, Europe and Asia, Westphalian system and Sinic order. The great Chinese empire was brought down to its knees after several humiliating defeats. And it was lucky for China that it was not partitioned into colonies, but only spheres of influence dominated by different Western powers. Now, Brantly would say that was because China was too big to swallow, but I would still contend that not to be a colony is better than being a colony. Before the Chinese learned how to modernize itself, to raise its technological level, to increase its productivity to near the West, and with all that, of course, to build a modern army. Before that, China could not reverse its relation with the West and regain its dominant position in East Asia. So the crux of the matter is institution. Now, there are four modernization routes, each with its ideal and institution. The renovation of the old system, like the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which was successfully done, or the Wushu reform in China, which was a blatant failure. So that's the first route of modernization. The second one is liberal democratic republic, an ideal that inspired Sun Yat-sen and his comrades, the revolutionaries, to found the Republic of China. But that was unrealizable in warlord politics in the beginning years of the Republic. The third route is modernizing authoritarianism as represented by the KMT. And the fourth one, state socialism or communism, was represented by the Chinese Communist Party. So we just, today is the centennial of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 spelled the end of the renovation approach. And the May 4th movement of 1919 was the last gasp of liberalism. The liberals, they were trying to, through the May 4th movement, to try to put China again on the route towards a liberal democracy, but that failed. So ever since 1919, the Chinese intellectuals just flocked to either modernizing authoritarianism or communism. The major champions of these two routes themselves were originally in the liberal camp. So people like Chen Duxiu or Li Dazhao, they were radical liberals, but they turned themselves into communists when they saw that liberal democracy had no future in China because it could not end warlord politics. The duel between these two routes of modernization, modernizing authoritarianism and communism, occupied the center stage in the following decades. Until after 1949, the KMT that represents modernizing authoritarianism retreated to Taiwan, whereas the CCP, communism, built a new nation on the Chinese mainland. The cross-strait stalemate then took a new form. In the 1980s, mainland China embraced modernizing authoritarianism, albeit a slightly different version. It is the post-totalitarian authoritarianism, but nevertheless, it is a change of development route. So in the 1980s, mainland China embraced that. In the 1990s, Taiwan transitioned to liberal democracy. The conflict between the two persists. Throughout the process, we find that China has to determine its route of modernization. It cannot research when it is boggled down in conflicts among forces representing different modernization routes. And then the route chosen needs to be effective in raising the technological level and productivity. So you have two tests. The first one is you have to settle down on one route of modernization. The second one is the route chosen needs to be effective in raising productivity. When China suffered in the strife of choosing the route, namely during the Republican period in mainland China, when it fought invasion by Japan, a successful modernizer, and then suffered again from experimenting with the chosen route, that is under Mao Zedong, it could not surge. It could not become a major power. This is the period of what I would call confused modernization. The right, quote unquote, institutional mix has to be found in order for China to grow rapidly. That institutional mix turns out to be authoritarian, not totalitarian, but authoritarian politics plus state capitalism. a kind of modernizing authoritarianism. This formula proves its effectiveness for Taiwan when it was under the authoritarian rule of the KMT, and has been serving China since it adopted the open door policy and economic reform. Of course, there are differences between the modernizing authoritarianism of the KMT under the martial law in Taiwan and the post-totalitarian authoritarianism practiced by the CCP in today's China, but there are striking similarities. And the effect on sustained economic development and growth is similar. The period of Western colonization, decentering of Asia, and American imperium, so vividly narrated by Brantly, coincided with China's failure to adopt the institutional mix for rapid modernization, that is, during China's confused modernization. When the right institutional formula was chosen, China, with its huge population and resources, then rapidly rose to challenge the American hegemony. So all flows from this. As Brantly argues, during the period of confused modernization and decentering, China became a fellow victim with its East Asian neighbors. It is no longer the center. The West was seen as with a higher cultural. Chinese identity was transformed. The Chinese response to the challenge by the West, be it liberal democratic, that is the Anglo-Saxon model, modernizing authoritarianism, that is the German model, or communism, that is the Soviet model, or stand from the West, from the core of the West, from the semi-periphery of the West, or from the periphery of the West. But as China regained its strength and confidence, it increasingly harks back on its own history and culture. Cultural revolution gradually yields to cultural renaissance, the base of which is the country's rising power. Together with that, we are going to see East Asia recentered, albeit in the context of global competition between the United States and China, and as Brantly would argue, a multi-nodal world. To sum it up, the centering of East Asia in its pre-modern history, the decentering of the region and the recentering are determined by China's power, which in turn is determined by whether China can choose an institutional path that leads to rapid rise in productivity and growth of the economy. So institution is the core, and it is the fundamental cause of the phenomenon that we are trying to explain, namely centering, decentering, and recentering of East Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Yushan, for stand there. Thank you very, very much, Yushan, for typically insightful comments. I'm going to ask Brantly to respond to you while we get some questions. When we start doing questions, we'll also have a microphone to pass around to those of you here in Now Hall. And once we get into the Q&A, then I'll try to alternate depending on how many questions are coming in online and how many hands are raised here between our live audience and our online audience. But let me invite Brantly to come back up to the podium to respond to Yushan. And I want to underscore a couple of things that he said that struck me too in thinking about your lecture last time. And that is, what is really the essence of presence? Productivity is pretty clear. You indicate there are various kinds of artisanal, manufacturing. Now we talk about more digital, but I think we understand what that means. We certainly understand what population is, though we could ask how important is the health of that population. But presence was always a little vague to me. And I think that what Yushan has done is to underscore, if I understood him correctly, that it really has as much to do with perceptions as reality. Not only the perceptions that China's neighbors, and now the rest of the world, have of China, but the perceptions that Chinese have of themselves about their role, past, present, and future, in this part of the world. And also, I think he underscores throughout his remarks, especially towards the end, the importance of perhaps another variable that unfortunately does not begin with the letter P, and that is culture. A cultural power, cultural influence, soft power perhaps. And so I'm wondering if we could invite you to respond to Yushan's insightful comments, and perhaps especially the idea that presence is really perception, and perhaps there's another dimension of power, and that is culture, a little bit different than production, but culture.
Well, thank you very much, Harry. Your comments and Yushan's comments together really raise a new dimension for us to think about, or several new dimensions. One of them is the institutional base of the changes, and another one would be the this question of what is presence. And I think of the essence of an international presence, being presence, as a question of attention. And if you think about it, attention looks like it's simply a question of perception. You know, what am I seeing when I'm looking at China, whatever? But what attracts attention? What is this relationship of cognition and interests? And why do I look? If somebody says, "Oh, there's a snake," you know, why do I look and see if that's really a snake? Because you feel vulnerable, you feel exposed, and the closer the snake is, the more exposed you feel. Okay, so that's certain. That, in a sense, the snake is present to you. Okay, how? Of course, I'm not comparing China to a snake. Okay, so please, you know, I perhaps should have used a more positive example, like an ice cream cone, perhaps. But the basic idea is attention. And the reason I stress attention rather than simply power is that I think in the multinodal world that, as Yushan says, we're going to be talking about more next time, a multinodal world is one in which power is still important, but it doesn't simply command. It's not a unilateral ability to say, you're weaker than I am, you have to do what I say. Need I point out our withdrawal from Afghanistan as an example of the lack of ability to enforce an obvious difference in power. Okay. But so if power is real, power is significant, but doesn't necessarily determine, why do we pay attention to it? We pay attention to it because we're exposed to more power. More people are looking at the US-China relationship now, even if they're Angola, even if they're Argentina, and they're looking at the Argentinian Cambodian relationship because they're more exposed to it. So I think that it's subjective. But it's not without basis. And if it turns out that that isn't a snake over there, I'll stop paying attention to that stick. Okay. So there's this interaction between perception and reality is something that I would stress. Yushan's description of the problems of institutionalization, the problems of modernization models is really, I think, a very valuable addition to our discussion here. And he did a really good job of presenting it, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on it, but just to point out that it's not simply a question of situational factors. It's not simply a question of the types of things that I have been talking about. It's also a question of the institutional context, the effectiveness of organization. And actually, as Dwight Perkins, an economic historian, has pointed out, the ability of China to reach back to its past of bureaucratic effectiveness in the 1950s and reestablishing its economy was very important. So institutional, it's not necessarily a continuity of institutional, you have an institutional memory that helps as well. And certainly the failure of Maoist leftism to produce a level of economic development that everyone, including the leftist, wanted, was the best argument for the bankruptcy of leftism, and Deng Xiaoping taking a very different road. But I don't want to take up any more time. I'm sure you have a million questions.
Well, we don't have a million. They are coming in.
Okay.
I'm going to stay. I'm not sure that we need to keep bouncing up and down.
Okay.
Brantly, if you'd like, I see that there is a stool that you could sit on and stay where you are. I'm going to stay here.
I think I can last a few more minutes.
Okay, good for you. The question I'm going to ask comes from Ezekiel Tan. And basically, he asks about what he calls Chinese sense of victimhood, or we could say that sense of continuous humiliation by outside. And I'd add to that question, I'd wonder about it too, because I have gone to other countries that have also been the victims of Western imperialism, notably the one that you know better than I, Vietnam. And I asked them, did Vietnam feel humiliated by French colonialism? Not at all. Just another foreigners come, they occupy us, we basically survive, they go away, but there's nothing humiliating about this. So the question is really, why does China have this very powerful sense of victimhood, and what is this going to be an enduring feature that survives no matter how much objective success China has? Again, the gap between reality and perception.
I think that's a great question, and I should have said something about that because it's humiliation, victims, lots of victims, and I think that important thing in the you hear a lot of criticism of victim mentality. There should be more criticism of victor mentality, because victor mentality sees victim mentality as a sign of weakness. Well, there was a reality behind the victim, and that has to be taken seriously. Okay, a really different, unique aspect for China, as you're pointing out, is this humiliation, the sense of national humiliation. And I agree with you that Vietnam that isn't an important component of Vietnam's sense of victimhood. Oh, it has victimhood sentiments, but not humiliation. Think about it in terms of the Jiaqing emperor, and what was going to happen after that. China losing the centrality, losing that cultural sense of confidence and cultural superiority, losing time after time, humiliation by outside powers. Now, Vietnam, the course of French colonialism in Vietnam is different. And Vietnam suffered from French colonialization. And I would agree with you, Sean, that it's better not to be a colony than to be a colony. Okay, and I'm sure the Vietnamese would agree with that as well. But I think the humiliation is that incredible fall of China from the center of a system that it thought it understood and was handling well, to beyond the periphery of a globalized world that it didn't understand and couldn't figure out how to relate to.
Thank you.
Now, perhaps if we studied the relationship of the Persian Empire to the expansion of Russia, and the constant, Persia kept on fighting the Russians and losing, fighting the Russians and losing. Maybe the Persians would have that same sense of humiliation by
Thank you. Are there any questions here in the audience? If so, we'll send a microphone your way. Yep, question right here. Right, sorry, I'll do him next.
We could take both. Yeah, that was first.
The masked man there.
We're all supposed to be matched.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
This was something that occurred to me during Brantly's presentation, but Professor Wu's comment sort of underlined it, for me at least. I understood what he was talking about as this sort of a 70 or 100-year period where China was thinking through what it had been experiencing for the previous couple of 100 years. And Brantly, you said at one point that in a certain point in time, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was no coordinated commercial transformation in China. I understand what you mean about that, but the thing that popped into my head was the double combination of missionaries and educational institutions. And I'm wondering about their effect in laying some sort of groundwork for the reconsideration he was talking about.
Well, that's a very good point, Fred. And I would have to say that I have to use the excuse that when you're painting a big picture, there's all sorts of important aspects and details that are neglected. And certainly there was a tremendous influence of missionaries, universities, et cetera, and in both directions, the Chinese going to outside, coming back, people like Pei Xiaotong giving his interpretations of Chinese villages. So that is significant in its own right. But in talking about the larger picture, more important, China was 90% rural at the time this was happening in Shanghai and Guangdong and other cities having higher education. And in those 90% rural areas where Mao had to first of all figure out how to survive and then how to build a rural revolution that could surround the cities, that was not the leading factor. Even though Zhou Enlai went to Nankai University and Mao Zedong went to Hunan Normal University, and both of these are progressive institutions. It wasn't what they learned at the university that made the rural revolution possible, but more the chaos that characterized the countryside.
We have a question online from one of our alumni. This is April Hurlevy.
Oh, great.
And she asks about how you would analyze the kind of intersection of two pieces of this historical situation. And that is China's territorial claims to Taiwan, to the Diaoyutai, to others, and the fact that in the past, many of these territorial claims those territories were occupied by political systems that had a tribute relationship with the imperial capital in Beijing. Do you see the intersection of the historical tribute patterns and modern territorial claims as a complicating factor or maybe an irrelevant factor in how China looks at them?
Well, of course, the details of the Diaoyutai claim between China, Taiwan, and Japan, or the Southeast Asian claims with 5.5 claims, China, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei. The details are endless. If you took all the writings about these things and put them on top of the islands would disappear. In all cases, and one of the really interesting things about the disputes is that the matter of the dispute seems so insignificant compared to the overall relationship between China and Japan, or the overall relationship between China and Southeast Asia. So why do these things become such sticking points? These
I think
sovereignty
that's what her
questions.
question boils down to.
Right, and my answer to that would be because, first of all, there are conflicting claims of sovereignty, and sovereignty is one of those ground wire type of of questions, even if it's about pretty worthless territory. Or islands that go up and come down again. Sovereignty is considered major, and not just because of territorial waters. There's something. If you tell people we're going to lose an island to China, you don't even care what island, and it makes a difference. And the other thing is the ambiguity, the increased interest in China and increased assertiveness on these things makes countries wonder, well, beyond this, where's the limit? It's the ambiguity of the future. The only thing that seems clear in the ambiguous future is that China is going to be bigger next year than it was this year. And that is scary if you don't know where China's going. And that'll be one of the big topics next week.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we are just about out of time, but I was about to call on this gentleman here with the blue shirt and the blue mask. And if he still has his question, why don't we take a question from him? Yes, thank you.
Hello, Professor. Professor.
Womack.
Trying to remember names. Professor Womack. Oh yes, okay. So my question comes down to at the end of your presentation, where you talk about the victimhoods of the China has faced, which, although is a historical form of historical trauma, and it is like true and it's happened. I've seen that recently through watching the news and all that. A lot of times China, especially the foreign ministry, tends to use these victimhoods as a way to clap back at the West in terms of a lot of conflicts with like territorial claims and other issues that tend to impact the relationship between the West and China. So as the recentering of the world sphere and world power goes back towards China and Asia, do you think there comes a point where the China tries to use the victimhood claim to kind of like push back at the West kind of becomes insignificant or kind of overused eventually in the future?
Well, it's a good question. It's more appropriate perhaps to next week than to this week, because that's when we'll be getting into real recentering. But that whole problem of China, one of my overall arguments is that China is primarily a regional power. The US is primarily a global power. But the thing is that where is the frontier? Where is the dividing line between the global? How can a global power not be a global power over a specific region? How can a regional power be submissive to a global power and still be a regional power? So there's this frontier, ambiguous frontier of relationships. And Taiwan is the perfect example of that ambiguous frontier between the United States and China, though it's bigger than just the United States and China, and it's bigger than just the question of Taiwan. And these will be questions that I don't know if we'll deal with them adequately next week, but we'll certainly be dealing with them.
Okay. Well, before we conclude, first I have a question for Brian. I saw coffee and all kinds of wonderful snacks on my way in. Was that a pre-lecture refreshments or after lecture refreshments or both?
I think if we're lucky, they'll be after.
Lucky. Okay, so you might want to see what's still out there on your way out, and maybe if there's anything there, maybe you can chat with whoever passes by on the way out as they leave. But before we call it a night, though you may not know it, walking up and down Rugby Road, there are still classes tomorrow. I believe tomorrow is still Friday, not quite yet the weekend. But I want to see if Wu Yushan has any final thoughts if he's still online.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yes, very well now.
I think the victimhood, the mentality of being a victim of China has a lot to do with the relative deprivation. Namely, the Chinese tend to think that their nation has very ancient civilization, the most continuous one, that today still shines, that it had built great empires, it has a lot of civilizational influence, not only in the region, but throughout the world. So we have that kind of imagination of your past, and then you compare that with what you have today. then the relative deprivation will bring about very strong mentality of victimhood. It's not the case that every nation in the world can imagine the country in history was the largest and most powerful empire, but China can. So I think that has to do with a very strong sense of victimhood by many Chinese when the victimhood, when China was victimized by the West. So I think that explains to some degree about the particularly strong sense of this victimhood. Thank you.
I'm afraid that that is all the time that we have. As we saw last week when Professor Wang Gongwu, who I think was listening in at least for most of the, if not all of the conversation this evening, we have a kind of a real joy of having a first-rate lecture followed by very insightful commentary, followed by excellent questions, both from the live audience and the on-live audience. And I'm sure that next week we will have the same combination, and we all look forward to it. But before we finally disperse and see if there are any snacks left, please join me one last time in thanking Brantly for an excellent lecture number 2, and we look forward to lectures number 3 and 4 in due time. We'll see you all next week.
Let me thank Harry and Shirley and Wu Shan for their wonderful contributions. Thank you. Thank you.